Good morning. Good morning and welcome to this digital summit, which is hosted by the Global Landscape Forum on collaboration to restore coastal and rural areas with particular emphasis on participatory modeling. My name is Joris de Vente and I'm a researcher at the Spanish National Research Council in Murcia in southeastern Spain. Before we start with our talks by the panelists, I would like to briefly explain the idea for this digital summit that actually originates in two different projects in which we are a partner. The first project is the Enable project, which is a partnership in which we developed educational tools based on integrated landscape management and based on sustainable business models. The second project is the Coastal project, which is a European research project that is looking for sustainable development based on synergies between coastal and rural areas. Now, in these two projects, but also many other development projects, we see that stakeholder partnerships and also participatory modeling are often very helpful, first to understand why the social ecosystem behaves the way it does, but also to identify opportunities for landscape restoration within that system. And thirdly, to create ownership over potential solutions amongst the people that participate in the participatory process. Now, that's all very nice, but there are also certainly challenges to these kind of methodologies and how to implement them. So that's actually the reason why during this digital summit, we will look at 5 different stories of the panelists who will share with us their experiences, and it will illustrate how collaboration helped them to identify opportunities and synergies for restoration of coastal and rural areas, and how they dealt with the challenges that they encountered in this process. Now, so far as an introduction, just the logistics, the way this works is that we will first listen to the 5 stories by the 5 panelists, or actually 6. 5 stories, and then we will have about 30 minutes in the second half of the summit for discussion and to answer the questions from the audience. So if you are in the audience, the best way to ask a question is by using the question box below on your screen, so that the question comes to us in a most structured way. You can also see that there's a chat box on the right of your screen where you can also comment and ask questions, but it's easiest for us if you could ask the questions using the option below on the screen. That's called Ask a Question. Okay, well then, without further delay on the introduction and the context, I will just go directly to our first speaker, who is actually sitting next to me, and he's one of my colleagues. His name is Javier Martinez Lopez, and he's a researcher also at the Spanish National Research Council. And he will present to you an example of how participatory modeling is used in the Coastal Research Project to identify synergies for sustainable development of the coastal lagoon area, which is based, the synergies are based on business opportunities and on policy support. So I will give the floor to Javier, move the camera a little bit so you can see him, and put his presentation on screen.
Yeah, full screen. I'm not sure whether everyone can hear as well, but in case you cannot, please mention that on the chat so that we can try to fix it. So thank you very much, Joris, for inviting me. As Joris explained, I'm working for the Spanish National Research Council together with him, and this study that I'm going to present is framed under the Coastal Project. So the Coastal Project is a European project that aims to find synergies between economic activities in European coastal and rural areas to promote sustainable development. There are 6 case studies throughout Europe, and we are working in this yellow area in the southeast of Spain in the Mar Menor lagoon. So the study area comprises the Mar Menor lagoon, which is a semi-enclosed coastal lagoon, but also the contributing catchment area. The lagoon has a high protection status, ranging from regional to international level, and the main economic activities and environmental pressures are intensive agriculture, which is exporting inorganic nutrients and pesticides, seasonal tourism, fisheries, and saltplant. The project is very much based on participatory modeling, so we try to combine the knowledge of the different stakeholders involved in the Mar Menor lagoon and the contributing watershed and build models to guide sustainable development. So the way we proceed is the following. We start with sectorial workshops and then continue with multi-sectorial workshops. We also start with qualitative modeling and continue with more quantitative modeling. The reason why we start with sectorial is to try to avoid power imbalances and conflicts, as well as to try to put a focus on every specific sector in the initial phase. Then we continue with multi-sectorial workshops because we want to reach a consensus and co-develop together with the stakeholders the models. And we start also with qualitative modeling because we want to make an initial phase of exploration of trade-offs and understanding and how the system works among all the stakeholders. And then at the end, we perform the quantitative modeling to evaluate the system dynamics initiatives and propose recommendations for sustainable development. So we started with 6 sectorial workshops that happened last year. During those workshops that are meant to the sectors that you can see on the right-hand side, we discussed sectorial challenges and opportunities for further development in the relation to the sustainable development of the lagoon. So during this discussion, we extracted variables and relationships among them in positive and negative terms to create a socio-ecosystem conceptual map for each of the sectors, as you can see with an example below. Then we combined more or less automatically, after homogenizing the variables, the map, all the 6 maps, into one map, a huge one. And we also added relative weights to the relationships based on the expressed importance by the participants. We did that because we wanted for this qualitative modeling phase, as you will see later on. So as an example, you can see, for instance, how the variable social welfare was very much mentioned during the sectorial workshops. And after the combination, we found 7 different variables that are directly inputting or influencing this variable, like house prices in coastal areas, muddy floods, quality of the jobs, etc. Then, after the 6 sectorial workshops, we performed a multi-actor workshop. So there were participants representing all the sectors, and the objectives were, first of all, to show the knowledge that we gained by combining the information from the sectorial workshops. So we discussed the combined model structure, the main interactions, and the impacts of some preliminary scenarios, as you will see later. And we also tried to identify main opportunities for sustainable development by performing an intersectorial group work to propose initiatives. And last but not least, we also wanted to start building trust and common ownership of the combined conceptual model among the stakeholders. This is an example of the fuzzy cognitive mapping technique that we use for qualitative modeling. Basically, here it's all is in relative terms. But for instance, if you increase the Mar Menor water quality, and you will increase variables that are directly and indirectly connected to it, like lagoon biodiversity, ecotourism, but also scuba diving or fish stocks. So with this, we try to make to the people to understand the interaction and the trade-offs in a preliminary way. So basically, after this workshop, we identified also after the group work 3 main opportunities in relation to sustainable tourism, sustainable agricultural management practices, and participatory governance. What we think of how stakeholders responded so far is that, okay, in the sectorial workshops, it was very easy to interact. There was a very positive response, a lot of communication. In the multi-sectorial workshop, the first one that we had, there were some tensions, like people were not so eager to talk. Maybe they were a bit afraid because they didn't know each other or because they didn't know what the other's opinion was. But also it was difficult to understand the combined conceptual model because there are a lot of variables, although we did our best and we think we more or less managed to do that. And the group work was certainly very, very fruitful. What are the next steps? Now still we need to evaluate initiatives, assess trade-offs, and promote synergies in a more quantitative way. So together with them, the next workshops will aim to co-develop these coupled system dynamic models based on the proposed initiatives as a decision support tool later on. Then we will evaluate the model results based on the scenarios that are proposed by each sector that will be try to guide policy and management recommendations. And finally, we will try to disseminate results to society also and also to every sector. And here below, you can see the main models that we are now developing together with them, and then will be coupled and will be assessed based on long-term sustainability indicators. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Javier. I'm going to stop sharing this presentation. I understand the sound is not optimal. I hope we can work on that. So we're trying to get that a bit better. But meanwhile, we will continue with the second presentation, which is the presentation by the second speaker, by Oscar Esparza Alaminos. And he works for WWF in Spain, where he works on sustainable management of marine and coastal protected areas. And based on his practical experience from the field, he will share with us his lessons learned on participatory management and governance for coastal and rural areas. Oscar, please go ahead.
Okay, hello everyone. Thanks, Juries and Javi, for the invitation and presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep, okay. For me, it's a pleasure to be with you this morning. I'm a marine ecologist, and I've been working on MPAs for 20 years, more or less. And in recent years, I've been working for WWF Spain to increase the marine protection, to stop biodiversity loss, habitat destruction, and achieve a coherent network of MPAs, marine protected areas. In all these years, working with different stakeholders to accomplish these goals and transform society, the most powerful and effective change tool I've known has been effective and real participation. The participation and real stakeholder engagement in the process of our management of the sites and natural resources contribute to improve the quality of decision taken, thanks to the variety of visions that allow for better diagnosis and exploration of a greater diversity of solutions and measures, and they open channels for the stakeholders to collaborate in implementation of the decision taken. It helps to prevent conflicts, improves the understanding of decision and measures adopted, facilitate social integration, provides greater equity and legitimacy by ensuring greater compliance with regulation and optimizing the governance of the areas. In addition, the sense of belonging, social learning, and shared responsibility are fomented, elements that improve the motivation of all stakeholders, and they become beneficiary partners of these areas. It's critical to note that the participatory engagement of stakeholders is perhaps the most important component of the planning and development of a protected area or a management plan. Meaningful engagement depends on the ability of stakeholders to build a healthy, lasting, and trustful relationship among them, including, of course, local communities. This is a scheme of the theoretical model that we carry out in the field, in the last years. At each step toward increased stakeholder engagement maturity, different techniques will be required. Some techniques or tools may be more useful at some stages of the process than others. Here, the preliminary context analysis and adequate stakeholder mapping are key aspects when planning and designing the participatory processes. Tools such as participatory modeling can help in the early steps. But all this is mainly theory, and I wanted to use this time with you to share my experience, the experience of WWF's work, and the lessons learned that we have had working all over Spain in different places with mainly fishermen and managers, and some of the challenges that we now have to achieve a new way of managing the sea with this approach. In the beginning, NGOs and fishermen were something like enemies, but through dialogue, listening, learning from each other, and drinking a lot of beer, we built a mutual trust and a common vision of the future. It's just kidding, a lot of beer. And we discovered that we wanted the same thing, more fish in the sea. So in that point, we opened eyes and started working together. These processes are not easy, and they are extremely demanding. They require an understanding of the relationships between the territorial local communities, commitments, restrictions, obligations, that must be concrete with the involvement of all stakeholders, even before the project for the creation of a protected area or a management plan. And every day, more and more, they demand to be present in the decision-making processes. And now artisanal fishermen and local communities are one of our most valuable allies in many areas for the conservation goals. So in some sites, they fund scientific studies with their own money and use this data for conservation. For example, in Catalonia, in order to manage the marine resources by creating co-management committees. In Balearic Island, fishermen has promoted the creation of 3 new marine reserves last year. Or in the Gulf of Cadiz, they were working with us and with other scientists to create a new MPA. This is something unthinkable 50 years ago. With all this background, from now until 2024, we are in a huge project with ministry, other regional governments, fishermen associations, scientific organizations, and NGOs to change the way the sea is managed, working with a sea surface the size of Greece. And this project is called Intemares, and you can see more information of their website or on WWF website. And as I said before, transforming the participatory culture requires effort and commitment. The quality of relationships determine the quality of governance model. And at this point, for me, the most important challenge we have now is to change the participatory culture of managers, but particularly the politicians. Because if there is a commitment at certain level, the processes are much simpler. It's very necessary, the political implication, because they have the capacity to change laws, regulation, and to push this kind of processes. It's necessary to change the way in which the administration relates with the territory and society. And this can only be learned with experience, getting involved, traveling, listening, talking, preparing workshop, etc. To finish, 2 very important factors that are not normally taken into account and that determine the success of the participatory processes. It's essential to hire, if possible, free professionals with expertise in participatory processes, conflict mediation, and group facilitation, so that they can moderate the meeting and workshops and provide an adequate training to other stakeholders. And the other thing is to know how to manage the expectations, not to create false expectations on stakeholders. And here, the sincerity, transparency, access to information, effective communication tools, and accountability are key to success. I think that's all. I hope this has been useful for you, and don't hesitate to write me for any clarification and consultation in my email. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oscar. That was excellent for that interesting story from real life. So way beyond only science, but really collaboration for practical implementation. So I would like to ask you to stop sharing your screen, Oscar, so we can share a different screen and go to our next speaker, which are actually 2 speakers, which are Anna Lideve and Eliana Teixeira, who both work at the Center for Environmental and Marine Studies at the University of Aveiro in Portugal. And they will bring to us their story on participatory coastal management in a protected landscape through elicitation of stakeholder preferences. So Anna and Eliana, you can now share your screen.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. So with more, I would like to share with you the examples of 2 EU projects that we run here at the Ria de Aveiro Coastal Lagoon, and we will share with you some of the participatory process that we performed in these 2 European projects. Of course, it involved a multidisciplinary team. This is one of the first key messages, is that to address these issues, we need a multidisciplinary team. And of course, as also mentioned, we need to be trained, as this was carried out in local language. In case of Portugal, we had the entire contact with stakeholders was in Portuguese. We were trained, I'm a natural scientist, and I was trained to be able to collaborate. Another thing is we engage with stakeholders from the beginning of the project. So in this first project, we started in 2011. So it was a science policy stakeholders interface, and we were covering from catchment to coast. So we had science, policy, and stakeholders involved. In the case of policy, we were focusing on the Water Framework Directive, on the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, and on integrated coastal zone management. Then we were focusing on the science part, on the land-sea processes. We also developed qualitative scenarios, quantitative scenarios together with the stakeholders. And here we had a sequence of participatory processes from focus groups, citizen juries, and workshops. Here we can see that we did it in parallel. So we had, on both sides, we had the the social science approach combined and interacting since the beginning until the end of the project that lasted for 3 years with the modeling approach. So we started with the focus groups. So we had the stakeholders mapping, and then we started with the focus groups in the different parish or different areas of the lagoon, where we identified the main drivers and concerns for the development of the storylines. And then we transfer this knowledge also to the modeling team so that they could start to the setup, calibration, but also to take into account the variables that were part of the stakeholders' concerns. Then we had a second participatory approach. It was the citizen juries. And here there was the refinement of the storylines, and also we introduced the socio-economical data for the prospective scenarios. So we could take into account the stakeholders' concerns, the stakeholders' main objectives, and also the social-economical conditions. And again, it was coupled with the modelings from catchment to coast. We can see we had different teams dealing with the two modelling approach. And then we had also the stakeholders to help us to identify the main areas. So we also use a special explicit information from the stakeholders, so it could also be combined with the modeling. And then we had the presentation. We had 4 possible storylines of management scenarios, integrated management scenarios of Ria de Aveiro from catchment to coast, that we shared with the stakeholders. And then we ended up with management recommendations at regional, national, and European level. Actually, some of these recommendations are already under implementation, and we still work with the stakeholders. And I will give the floor to Eliana.
Well, I am going to talk to you specifically about one of our latest projects and how we incorporated in this most recent project the stakeholders' inputs into our models. So the area that we work on, Ria de Aveiro, it's a very huge Nature 2000 area, and this specific project was focusing on a small area within the lagoon that had some agricultural activities, traditional agricultural activities that had been target of management. We wanted now to move on to the management of the lagoon as a whole, and for this project we selected a method of participation aiming to deal with 2 challenges. So the 2 challenges that I brought here to show you are how to deal with potential conflicting interests and priorities from a variety of stakeholders, because we have we have from policy, governance, public administration, citizens, environmental scientists, interest groups, business, and how to deal with their expectations, with their priorities, with the activities in place, and also with the conservation interests. So this is one of the challenges. The other challenge was we wanted to introduce a new concept, which was the ecosystem services. Although stakeholders know in general what the ecosystem services approach would be, in practice, how could we implement this? There were 2 positive things to use this approach of the ecosystem service. from one way we could move on from selecting areas which would be more prone to bias because people have a direct attachment to specific habitats or specific areas in the lagoon, to choose instead values and services that are important to the different stakeholders and could be delivered elsewhere in the lagoon. Another advantage is that ecosystem services would be a, can you see the screen?
Yes, yes, yes.
We see it.
The second issue would be it would constitute a common language for the different types of stakeholders. The difficulty of using this is that there are a lot of variables to deal with when you are working with ecosystem services, because even if we simplify classifications like the size is one, we still have a lot of variables to work with in practice. And these variables would be new concepts for them. So we developed support information so they could relate easily to each ecosystem service that we wanted them to value, and they could locate it easily also in relation to the habitats that are present in this lagoon, coastal lagoon. So how did we ended up collecting their opinions on the value of the ecosystem services in the lagoon? The first thing that we did is that we had them compare the value the ecosystem service in a pairwise comparison format, because it was easier for them to compare 2 by 2 than to rank a bunch of 11 services. This would avoid errors, inconsistencies, and it would allow us, using an analytic hierarchy process, to actually follow the accurate and eliminate non-consistent replies. We use different formats. We use the scale, a voting scale, Likert 5 levels bidirectional ordinal scale with equivalent negative and positive statements, and they would have to see if the service 1 is much more important, equally important, less important, or much less important. And this would make the exercise easier and would engage them more easily into this process. We also introduced the step of validation. So after their voting, all of the stakeholders, we went through their answers, and with this consistency rate of individual judgments, we could actually eliminate those answers that were not consistent. So if service 1 is higher than 2 and 2 is higher than 3, then 3 cannot be higher than 1. So this allows to introduce some rigor into the inputs that will go into our models later. During this process, we also were we tried to be very transparent to them how we would use their knowledge. And one of the things that we did, we had them classify themselves in terms of type of stakeholders that they viewed. And we wanted to know if the valuations were type specific. So if some stakeholders would value some services more than others. And we actually found out that there wasn't, as we would expect, that stakeholder type related service valuation ranking. So we came up with 2 different groups, very heterogeneous, and then we used this ranking of these 2 different groups to include this information into our model. We also included, because there were no type specific and not much difference in the rankings, a compromise, a third scenario, compromise ranking of services. How did this go into the final models in this specific case? So we had, of course, previously modeled our species distribution and transformed this into habitats distribution. And then we made our predictions for the futures, having the scenarios that we had from previous projects. We had already mapped the ecosystem services in the entire lagoon, the potential for delivering the different services based on expert judgment and a semi-quantitative approach from also a previous step. And now what we did in this stage is that we included the prioritization made by the stakeholders into the models to help select priority areas in this system. And this way, we think we managed to have a more fair contribution and a more unbiased selection of priority areas across the entire lagoon from the different types of stakeholders. The key areas were established using a spatial multi-criteria analysis based on the evaluation of mixed data procedure approach. And you can find more information on this on the paper that is published. You have the link there, and we are happy to explain any other thing you want to know further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, both of you. That was really very interesting story from Portugal. We will now move on to the next speaker. Let me see. I kind of have to activate him again.
Yes.
So that is it's coming up. So our next speaker is Nagesh.
Hello.
Good morning, Nagesh. He is a faculty member of the Centurion University in India with wide experience in participatory GIS and in participatory modeling. And Nagesh will share with us his experiences with participatory modeling for identifying a sustainable solution to rural groundwater and farming crisis of an Indian village. So Nagesh, the floor is yours. You can share your presentation if you like.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll start talking now, Xavier.
Yes. Yeah. There you go.
Okay. So I work in with the villages in India. Here it is a case of over-exploitation of groundwater resources, with which the farming has collapsed. I'll just show you some pictures. So my village, this particular village is in South India, about 200 kilometers from Chennai, a metropolitan big city in South India. We have relied extensively on maps. We help school children prepare these maps using Android mobile phones equipped with GPS, which have become very popular in the last 10 years. The school children prepare the maps with the help of their school teachers, and their parents, semi-literate farmers, use these maps. A picture speaks better than words, and we found maps to be very helpful. It's something that I recommend all of you to try. And we have come up with open source mobile and web applications to make this possible. If anyone is interested, we'll be glad to share and help them. So what is the problem in my village? In the 70s, there were open wells that were powered by cattle, about 76 of them. Then the 80s and 90s, the government stepped in and it gave free electricity to increase agriculture production, etc. And you can see in the right top, by 1990s, you had about 198 electrified open plus tube wells. Not only the number has increased from 76 to 198, the power of these wells also is much, these electric motors is about 3 times that of a pair of bullocks, cattle. And they can also work much longer hours, 1.5 years because of power cuts. Together, the amount of water they were drawing for about 2 decades was 13 times more than what they were doing earlier. The rainfall, if any, has not increased, it only has decreased. Okay, so all this has resulted in gradual decline of the water table over the years from 1990 to 2005, etc. Eventually, once they hit the hard rock, there is no more groundwater available below, and the whole bubble has burst. Now, whereas if you still, even in 2015, when we did calculations of how many wells were working, there are about 35 wells working out of these 198. But the quantity of water that they were getting is roughly same as what they were getting earlier in 70s. It's just that it is concentrated in fewer hands. So now, is it possible how to solve this water crisis? Immediately, government steps in and wants to increase recharge, rainwater harvesting, because that is capital intensive and contractors and everybody loves capital infusion. Whereas the bigger problem is actually how to regulate the discharge. That is how to control the overexploitation. So one way to go about that we have tried is how to interconnect all these wells and farms and facilitate some kind of a water market. Groundwater is everybody's. Ideally, people should share, but sharing is something very difficult, at least if we can facilitate selling. So pipelines is something that makes it possible for people with water to sell to people without water. And here are people where we have held various focus group meetings and trying to design using Google Earth, pipeline network, etc. in an optimal way, socially as well as technically. So the implementation challenges are how to optimize this network connectivity, how to use IoTs for sensors, actuators, etc., and how to procure funding for all these. But the biggest challenge for us has been something different, how to get people to work together. Here is a bigger village meeting where we go from focus groups to a larger audience, and their collaboration consensus is not as easy. So that we found is much more challenging than actually the technical problems. So we wanted to take to them a more sophisticated what if scenario analysis than just maps. For that, we tried system dynamics. We used initially AHP analytic hierarchy process, went to them and tried to take public opinion into account so that whatever AHP we do, the ultimate test is what a few experts have given, a few stakeholders. Does it match with the public perception or not? That is one thing we try to use as a benchmark to our model. We should never be happy with a model till it meets the overall perception of people is what we tried doing here. Same thing with the software that we developed. But the biggest, and now we are trying to do with system dynamics, the same thing. But what we found is these models have heavy uncertainties, and slightest change in parameters seems to make the results vary significantly. How to communicate those model uncertainties to people? So the best way we found is, yes, we show the models, but we show them by saying, look, if you try different parameters, the results can vary quite substantially, so that they get to see that there's a range in which these models should be believed in, not as prescriptions. These are what we are trying. Yeah. Xavier, I am done.
Okay, thank you very much, Nagesh, for your very interesting presentation. So we will now move on to our last speaker already. And our last speaker is Alexei Voinov. Alexei is a distinguished professor at the University of Technology in Sydney, in Australia, where he leads the Center on Persuasive Systems for Wise Adaptive Living. And he's also still professor at the University of Twente in the Netherlands. Well, he is an expert in participatory modeling, and he will share with us from his experience, his reflections regarding the challenges and solutions of participatory modeling within decision-making processes. So, Alexei.
Yes, hi, but I can't share my screen because it says that the event is maxed out.
Okay, I'm going to take out one speaker so you have space again.
Okay, let me try again. Yes, now I think it works. Your entire screen share. Okay. Okay. And okay, are we good?
No, yeah, there we go.
Okay, so thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the invitation. I'm not going to be talking about any particular projects. I'm going to be doing a bit of an overview and looking maybe a little bit into the future, and also hope that I'm not going to be really spoiling the whole party here. So first of all, I think there's quite already an agreement that participatory modeling is quite useful, and it's useful for learning. It's useful for sharing knowledge and for communicating with stakeholders. We do enjoy working with them when we can co-formulate the problem and using this for making our next steps. We do this primarily to increase trust, avoid conflict. Models in this case are used as consensus building tools. But historically, what seems to be also quite clear is that most of participatory modeling has been stemming from a very democratic worldview and the associated institutions. This, in my opinion, creates a bit of a challenge because we see that there is some kind of erosion and evolution of democracy right now. And in addition to some of the obvious kind of cases that we are observing now across the world, we see that there is a change in attitude. We see that stakeholders start to somehow differently interact with science, and instead of really listening to scientists and listening to experts, there is an obvious shift towards more. You can think about it as more participatory, but it's not really usually always very positive. In a way, social media starts to replace participation and starts to play an increasing role in all these kinds of interactions. We see more and more often that groups and people on social media become way more powerful than the scientific information that we are providing. And this has to also be somehow recognized in the participatory processes that we're organizing. As probably one of the outcomes of this, we see pretty extreme polarization that's happening. And this also speaks and relates to a lot of biases that are present in how people view reality and how they interact. And this polarization is also something that comes from quite a huge difference in the income levels and in the power balances. If you compare the growth of GDP with the growth of another index, which actually takes into account a lot of other the factors, you can see that after the 70s, it has been pretty much stagnating. In a large part, this also is explained by a huge disconnect between productivity and the compensation that regular workers are receiving. So the Gini index is increasing. We see that there's more and more polarization in this regards. And agreements and priorities which are not necessarily always very democratic. We, for example, looking at the investments in clean energy, for instance, we can see that the non-developed world is actually contributing now more than the developed countries. And this trend is especially clear if we compare, for example, China to the rest of the world. So in a way, we have like a switch in leadership in a lot of regards. And China is not the most democratic country in the world, as we know. So how can participatory methods and participatory modeling be implemented in these societies, which are not really very democratic, which have different traditions, which have different ways of doing things, is another challenge that I think is worthwhile considering. So how do we adapt participatory modeling and research to these new realities? What we can do to somehow live with this. And that's pretty much all that I needed to say today. And I have to stop sharing my screen like this. There we go.
Thank you very much, Alexa, for this critical reflection and stimulating thoughts, I think. And a very good start to kick off our questions and discussion on this topic, on the values of participation in general and more particularly participatory modeling. Now we have received several questions in our Ask a Question box. So I propose that we start answering these questions. So they are normally directed to a certain speaker. So I will go through them one by one, go through the questions that were raised and ask the speaker to provide an answer to that particular question. And then maybe if there are responses, of course, we are free to respond to that. And we can expand the discussion with some other topics as well if we like. So I would like to ask the first question that came for Oscar. I'm going to bring in Oscar in the screen again. So Oscar, one of the questions that was raised is if you did meet resistance from the fishing communities at any point, and if so, how you dealt with that resistance.
Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, sure. We have resistance for several stakeholders, but now there is already a lot of evidence of the benefits of the protection of our resources and the benefits of participation. No? When we select a site for a conservation initiative, we don't go in without talking with the stakeholders, no? Mainly with fishermen, but not only with fishermen, local communities, etc. If they have resistance, many times we organize exchange with other stakeholders, with other fishermen from other areas where they are carrying out similar initiatives or similar processes. So this could be very useful to solve this kind of resistance. But if they continue to resist any conservation initiative, we don't force the process. We leave the door open for when they are prepared and they want to knock our door. No.
Sorry.
I can't hear you, Yuri.
Yeah, thank you. So I have my mic muted. Sorry. So there's a second question that's related to that. So what is the main benefit that the fishers experience from participating? So why would they participate and support your actions?
For the point of view, in general, what we do is create the participation scenario where they are the ones who diagnose the problems and propose the common solutions. And we act in this point, no? The feeling that they are here, the feeling of the fishermen is they are here actively for the managers. And that traditional knowledge is taken into account and they can make the decision, they can participate in the decision-making processes. And this is the best experience for them, no? For this kind of processes, because it's a guarantee of the continuity and legitimacy of the process, and they have all the interest that the fishermen have in the management plan, more or less.
Okay, thank you. Then I'm going to switch to a question that was directed towards Javier. So that the question was, is it not too complicated to start the multi-actor workshop by discussing the model?
Yeah. So actually, we didn't start it like that. I just couldn't go into a lot of detail in the presentation, but that's why it was very, very useful to use the fuzzy cognitive mapping, I think, because this is this qualitative modeling that doesn't really give you, very precise results, but gives a very nice overview when you perform a what-if scenario, as Najes was also mentioning, how the model works. So what are the interactions in the model? What happens if you change a variable? What other variables are being affected? And that means that those other variables are more or less relevant to the sector, so they kind of see the synergies and trade-offs. And also, it's very interesting that, basically the scenarios were based on the most central variables in the network, meaning variables that have a lot of inputs and outputs. So we basically focus on them because there were 125 variables in the model, and of course we couldn't show the whole model. And also regarding the other question about the measures to improve collaboration, for us, one of the key points was to discover that all the participants in all the sectors were not just pointing to specific measurements or projects to develop, but basically to participatory governance. So I think there is really, at least in our case study, a lack of engagement from the government like this kind of discussion or workshops that we had, they don't really happen. Like they are not promoted by the government or the authorities, even mentioned by the public administrations sector. So I think that's the basic thing. As have more common stakeholder meetings, multi-sectorial meetings, would be really helpful, because they at the beginning maybe it's a bit slowly, but then they get to know each other and are really open to discuss.
Okay, thank you, Javier. Then we move to, we have several questions actually for Anna and Eliana. So I start with the first one, Anna and Eliana. So the first one is for your consistency validation of the rankings or the transitivity of the rankings. Do you recall the percentage of inconsistent answers? So was it very consistent or not so consistent? What you required as a review?
Yes, you can find more information on that you can share on the chat. And for this exercise in particularly, we actually found that 29% of the respondents were not very consistent in their valuation of the ecosystem services, and 6% could not perform a valuation because they considered everything equally important. So that's also very important information for us, because it shows that people still struggle even with the pairwise comparisons to really to keep consistency on their values of the systems. Either it's difficult to understand what the system actually refers to, and then or there are too many variables and they get, I don't know, tired to the end of the questionnaire and then just ask something. So we need to understand what's behind those 29% of failures, which we removed from the ranking, from the final ranking system, of course.
Okay, that's clear. And then a question to you as well. So it was considered very interesting to include the citizen juries. And the question is, were they eager to participate? And how did these differ or add value compared to the modeling exercise?
Mm-hmm. Yes, as I mentioned, one of the most important points was to engage with stakeholders from the beginning of the project. And we started with the citizen jury, with the focus groups, where we could establish a close interaction and understand the major concerns and the major concerns to be addressed in the citizen jury. So they were already engaged. Another important thing was that we always, after each participatory process, we would prepare a brief that we delivered back to all the stakeholders that were invited, not only the ones that were available to attend the meeting, but the ones that were invited, so they could all follow the project and how we were using the information. And this goes to and this information was feeding the models, of course, but not everything can go into a numerical modeling. For instance, water quality or climate change scenarios were easy to put into the modeling, but not some management options or and these we were using maps, we were using photographs, so we were really combining this qualitative information that we would illustrate by other means in the prospective scenarios and combine it with the modeling results to then to discuss the final recommendations. I can jump to the second because everything that all the references that we put it on the slides, they're open access. So even the book, so you can download the book from the web. But we can also place the direct link here in the chat, but with the title, it's open access. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, there's one question regarding similar projects, but maybe you can respond to that in a different river system in Portugal. Maybe you can respond to that in written, just if you are aware of any other studies. So just have a look at that question so that we can have that answered as well. I was trying to get in Nagesh, but it didn't work yet. So I will move then to a question for Alexei. Mm-hmm. So let me go to that question again. Well, first is quite clear. So you were critic or had some critique about the great use of Twitter and these kind of social media. And so the question is, don't you also think there are many positive opportunities in social media for the purpose of participation?
Absolutely. Actually, one of the projects that we're working on is developing a web tool which mines the ongoing discussion and extracts concepts and interaction, and is supposed to be creating a cognitive loop diagram, or maybe eventually even an FCM based on mining the texts of these comments that are available in either some of the existing social media tools such as Twitter or Facebook, but or also there's a designated discussion page that has been developed and is can be used without all the ads and other noise that is associated with the standard web tools. In a way, the idea is that we can open up the participatory process from just workshops that usually include no more than 20, 30 people to a much broader audience, and ideally generate some of the joint understanding with more people involved. So yeah, and there's obviously other means that we can explore the information that can be collected from social media. The only concern is that social media does seem to polarize people and bring them into some groups, and that is still a concern. How can you actually bridge between them? Ideally, we hope that more awareness and better information sharing can do that, but then you have to have the desire of people to accept this information.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Alexei. There's a related question, I think, that asks if you have any suggestions to adapt to this new reality, which is very real indeed, and maybe that links a bit to another question. How can we make use of citizen science in general and participatory approaches and make sure that the information is reliable and that it's
well, for one thing, I think it's really important to keep in mind that there are different possible worldviews, and for example, something that has been considered in China as a in a way perhaps a replacement for democracy, and called meritocracy. And it's not an issue of something being better or worse. It's just an issue of different ways that society can organize and change. And in the participatory process, I think what then becomes really important is to address not necessarily the general public, but perhaps groups of experts from different disciplines, and help them interact better between themselves, while at the same time creating ideally more transparency and ideally projecting the results to the wider population as much as possible. But it's really hard to say in which way the democratic processes are going to be developing now.
And then, well, there's actually a question directed to all speakers, but maybe now that you're talking on this, Alexei, you can give your first idea on this. What, in your view, is the key difference in a modeling process, and that is participatory versus a modeling process that's asking for data input by stakeholders?
Well, I think that's pretty clear, because we're definitely not only asking stakeholders, we're not just soliciting information from them. We're really creating partnerships. We're also allowing them to exchange information between themselves. We are providing information to them, so it works in a lot of different networks and a lot of different ways that information is getting shared. It's not a one-way exchange. It's not a one-way flow.
Okay, thank you. Now I have Nagesh back in again. So Nagesh, I will. We have a few questions to you as well from the audience. Let me go to the first one if I can find it quickly. I think this one here. So a nice and realistic approach to include and communicate uncertainties. How do the stakeholders deal with or react to this? Do they like the new insights? Does it enrich the discussion and the decision making, or does it make it more complicated?
Okay, so I found the main advantage of this participatory modeling was getting people to talk to each other who wouldn't otherwise talk. And to the extent models had uncertainties and we were presenting that range, that appealed because it could accommodate everybody's perspective. So nobody felt left out. We didn't want to say this is the result, which would have alienated some people. I personally liked the uncertainty so that everybody could somehow own it. Um, so they liked uncertainty. The groups which were feeling left out could join in and claim the model is justifying their stand too. If I had forced and projected it as if it was a certain result, that would have divided people for me. The uncertainty, the wider result set, I think made it more acceptable to more audiences. So I found that they were accepting this when we were frank and admitted our shortcomings.
Okay.
And maybe the same question to you as well, Nagesh. What is for you the key difference for a modeling process that is participatory versus one in which we are asking data input by stakeholders? So what is for you true participation?
I couldn't hear you, sorry.
Sorry, I will repeat it. So there's a general question to all the speakers. So what is for you the key difference in a modeling process that is participatory versus a modeling process that is only asking for data input by stakeholders?
Okay, our social technical problems are so complicated. There's no clear model that captures all of them. When we want to launch rockets, we don't go asking people because we know exactly how they behave. Whereas in a social technical problem, as scientists, we are quite off the mark, and we might as well accept that and incorporate people's perspectives so that we get communicate this uncertainty, communicate the we are making some modeling effort at least. If we exactly knew how things were, then we don't even need to go to them. So that sense of ownership, trust, collaboration, these are much more important than actual model results. So to that extent, participatory is a must. I feel in social technical problems.
Okay, thank you. We go on. Javier has an additional question to Alexei.
Yeah. So, Alexei, you were mentioning meritocracy and China, and seeing that the role of the government and the government style is so important. Do you think meritocracy is enough to find sustainable solution, or do we also need participation? Because I mean, I'm not sure that meritocracy alone will reach sustainable solutions. It's not maybe driven by that.
I honestly don't know the answer. We'll probably have to wait and see. And again, there is always a risk that meritocracy can also go into the wrong direction, obviously. But at least so far, we do see that they're advancing quite rapidly in the right direction. Even if we look at the investment, for example, in the low carbon options that are so important. Not to mention the fact that with meritocracy, they managed to stop the uncontrolled population growth in the country, which is really something that is absolutely essential for sustainable solutions. If we could somehow empower this with more transparency and participatory aspects, that could probably be better. But there's this balance, because once we open up this process, I guess it becomes easily going out of control. So I really don't know what the answer could be, but thanks for the question.
Well, now that you're speaking, Alexei, we have another question coming in. How are participatory models perceived in the wider modeling community? What is your experience with that? Are they perceived as valid, not valid?
Well, I think that their role is increasing to the extent that, well, even some of the funding agencies actually right now the word stakeholder becomes like a must if you want to have a successful project. So there is growing appreciation, in my opinion, but always to a certain extent, because obviously there are hardcore kind of people who think that this is more of, you know, bells and whistles rather than real stuff. So we still have work to do.
And if we turn that question the other way around, I think that can often be, that's a question I wanted to ask to you and also to Anna and Eliana actually. In your experience, how can we keep stakeholders involved throughout the participatory modeling process? Because sometimes the modeling might become very complex, and you might lose people on your way. That you think, you know, I want to do more complex things, and how do I do that?
Well, you know, for me, actually, one of the greatest advantages of the stakeholder process is that their involvement in many cases keeps complexity under control. So as we all know, making a model more complex is actually much easier than to make the model simple and to keep it simple. So by engaging these people and by having to be able to explain to them what you're doing, I think it's actually a positive that the models are not going out of control and not becoming as complex as possible. Because if that's the thing, then we basically lose the whole idea of modeling, which by definition is simplification of reality. So by replacing one complex system by another complex system, which we equally poorly understand, is not helpful. So stakeholders, in a way, and their participation helps, in my opinion. Okay, that's clear. And maybe Anna and Eliana, would you like to comment on that same question as well? Do you agree with what Lisa says, or do you have a different experience?
Yes, thank you. We totally agree. We were here also discussing offline that we had the same perception. And one of the things is sometimes, or most of the times, modeling is very much time demanding because of the computational time. So then we also need to be pragmatic. One of the ways, and for instance, to communicate to stakeholders, we were not interested in communicating the process, how the ecosystem would react on the climate change scenario, but what would be the final result, for instance, for a heat wave or for a storm event, or a flood event. So we could reduce this to the event, and we communicated the prospective scenario of this extreme event, and not the entire process, because actually it's very time demanding, and of course we would lose them in the process. So it's also to be selective but realistic, pragmatic, and focus on the essential that we need to discuss and to communicate. So this was also a learning process for all of us. I don't know if Eliana wants to. No, it's fine.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. That's interesting. We would like to ask another question also to Oscar, because often it's claimed that participation in general and participatory modeling as well can have a very clear role in conflict prevention, or to prevent conflict. And we would like to hear your idea if you probably have seen some conflicts during the processes or conflict of interest. And did you experience that indeed the participation and maybe also participatory modeling to some extent can help prevent these conflicts or reduce them somehow?
Yeah, sure. I think it's very useful in the early steps, of the process. And for me, the true participation is where all relevant stakeholders are informed and they can contribute to the process, but also they can really participate in decision making, And that's the way we're working with the stakeholders. There is a good example I share with you in the chat. You can see there a nice video of a participatory experience in Catalonia with Sam Deal, and it is very inspiring.
Okay, thank you very much, Oscar, for that insight as well. Maybe if there is any question from one of the speakers still, or something that you would like to comment, let me know right now. Otherwise, we're going to end this this digital summit. So I don't see any questions popping up. So I would like to thank very much all of the speakers for this. It has been very valuable, I think, at least to us. And also, I'd like to thank very much to the audience for their interesting questions and for joining us in this first digital summit that we organized on this topic. So thank you very much, and see you next time.